On the 6th of March, 1945, Operation Spring Awakening was still considered an offensive. On the maps of Army Group South, the arrows confidently pointed east, towards Dunahu. The Waffen-SS Tank Corps were still moving according to schedule, headquarters were still demanding pace, and radio operators were still transmitting reports about breaking through the first line of Soviet defense. But fuel was already lagging behind the columns, the ground under the tracks had already turned into black mush, and the troops of Marshal Tolbukhin, whose strength German intelligence knew far too little about, were already waiting for these tanks on pre-prepared lines. The plan still existed on paper. On the ground, in the triangle between Lake Balaton and Lake Velence, it was already dying. To understand why the last major offensive of the Third Reich died before it was officially stopped, one must look not at the beautiful arrows on the map, but at the fuel, the spring thaw, and the decisions made in Berlin contrary to common sense. This is not a story of valor or armored feats. This is a story of how the most powerful equipment of its time turns into dead metal when it has not a single drop of extra fuel and not one backup plan. And the louder the names of the divisions sounded, the quieter the reports about their remnants later became. If you are interested not in the ceremonial version, but in the cold mechanics of this catastrophe, watch until the end. Next will be a step-by-step breakdown, where the idea for the strike came from, what it was actually supported by, and why experienced headquarters undertook an operation whose outcome was clear in advance. By the beginning of 1945, the Third Reich was fighting in a mode best described by one word: starvation. Fuel starvation. After Romania with its oil fields near Ploiești was lost in the autumn of '44, and synthetic fuel plants were methodically burned out by Allied bombing, Germany had only a few sources of real oil left. One of the main ones lay in western Hungary, the Nagy-Kanizsa region, and the oil fields along the southern shore of Lake Balaton. Another was the Austrian Zistersdorf near Vienna. Together, they provided virtually the last natural fuel on which tank divisions could still move, and aircraft could still take to the air. Losing this oil, the Reich was not losing territory. It was losing the very ability to wage mobile warfare. A tank without fuel is not a weapon, but a concrete pillbox that cannot be moved. To appreciate the scale of this dependency, it is worth recalling how the German war machine was holding up at that point. For years, Germany had obtained a significant portion of its fuel not from wells, but from coal, at synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline and diesel through a complex chemical process. These plants were the miracle of the war economy and simultaneously its most vulnerable point. It was enough to destroy several key enterprises for the flow of fuel to the front to begin drying up. Allied aviation understood this, and from the spring of '44 struck them methodically, raid after raid. By the beginning of '45, synthetic production had been crippled, Romanian oil was lost, and every liter of fuel in the tanks of German tanks became worth its weight in gold. Against this backdrop, the Hungarian fields were turning not into an economic resource, but into an obsession. It seemed that by holding them, one could buy time. By this point, the Hungarian capital had already been lost. In mid-February '45, besieged Budapest fell, and the winter relief attacks that the Germans launched one after another to break through to the encircled garrison had faltered. These winter battles had already cost the Germans part of their tank fleet, which would now have been so useful for a new strike. Attempts to punch a corridor to the city followed one after another, and each one, having achieved local success, ran into Soviet defenses and rolled back, leaving burned-out equipment in the snow. The reserve that was to be thrown into battle at Lake Balaton was arriving at its starting positions already broken, with battered equipment, depleted crews, and overstretched supply lines. It would seem logical after this to switch to a tough defense and save what could still be saved. But in Berlin, they reasoned differently. They looked not at the lost city, but at the map of oil fields behind it. And it was from this arithmetic that the idea of a new offensive was born. Not defensive, but offensive. the last truly major strike by the Wehrmacht in the entire war. In the reports, it was presented as a return of the initiative. In reality, it was an attempt to wrest from fate a few more weeks of fuel, paying for it with the last strategic reserve. And the most terrible thing about this decision was not even that it had almost no chance of success, but that the price of failure was known in advance to those who could read maps and supply reports. Berlin's logic was simple and terrifying at the same time. As long as the Hungarian fields remained in their hands, the armored forces had blood in their veins. Lose them, and the most powerful divisions would turn into immobile steel boxes. And so, at a moment when the Red Army was already standing on the Oder, a few dozen kilometers from the capital of the Reich, the Führer made a decision that historians still argue about. The main strategic reserve, the last fresh tank army, he did not send to Berlin. He sent it to Hungary for oil. He essentially left the capital of his own state without a mobile reserve for the sake of oil rigs in a foreign country.
To understand how risky this decision was, one must imagine the overall picture of the front at that time. In the east, the Red Army had rolled through Poland in a winter offensive, reached the Oder, and secured bridgeheads dangerously close to Berlin. Between the forward Soviet units and the capital of the Reich remained a distance that mobile formations, if successful, could cover in a matter of days. In this situation, any sane calculation required keeping the last tank reserve right here, on the Berlin axis, as a fire brigade in case of a breakthrough. Instead, the best divisions were loaded onto trains and sent south, hundreds of kilometers away from where the fate of the country was being decided. This was not a choice between two good options, but between a bad one and a catastrophic one. And those at the top chose the catastrophic one. From the outside, it looked like the revival of Blitzkrieg. The 6th SS Panzer Army under the command of Sepp Dietrich was being secretly transferred to the Hungarian Axis, the very formation that just 2 months earlier had been on the offensive in the Ardennes. The transfer was disguised as much as possible. Radio silence was observed, trains were hidden, units were given false designations so that Soviet intelligence would not detect the appearance of an entire tank army in the south. It concentrated the cream of the armored forces: the Leibstandarte, Hitlerjugend, Das Reich, and Hohenstaufen divisions. Nearby, the corps of General Balk's 6th Field Army with the SS divisions Totenkopf and Viking were deploying. On paper, it was an armada. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns, including heavy Tigers, King Tigers, and Panthers. German reports painted a picture of an unstoppable armored fist assembled for a decisive blow. The very secrecy of the redeployment played a cruel trick on the Germans. To preserve surprise, Dietrich's army was rushed south by roundabout routes, on overloaded and battered railways, in haste, with constant delays. Units arrived in Hungary exhausted even before the first shot. Equipment required repair after the long journey. Crews had no time to rest. Supply lines were hopelessly stretched. Camouflage consumed time that was already in short supply, and the thaw, meanwhile, drew closer with each passing day. The worst possible outcome was achieved. True surprise could not be attained because Soviet intelligence had uncovered the concentration of a major tank force anyway, while their own troops approached the start of the operation already worn out. The plan was not merely to break through the front, but to split it. The main thrust was directed between lakes Balaton and Velence eastward, towards the Danube. If the tank wedges reached the river, the Third Ukrainian front would be cut into pieces, pressed against the water and deprived of freedom of maneuver. Simultaneously, further south near Nagykanizsa, the 2nd Panzer Army went on the offensive, directly covering the oil region. And from the south, across the swollen Drava River, Army Group E was to strike, drawing Soviet reserves onto itself. 3 diverging blows, which on the map formed a beautiful scheme of encirclement. On the ground, however, each of them ran into water, mud, and prepared defenses. And none had the fuel to reach its objective. The plan looked splendid in the office and almost ignored the main thing: the nature of the terrain and the time of year. The triangle between the lakes is not a steppe or a plain for a classic tank wedge. It is a narrow strip of land, squeezed between large bodies of water, cut by canals, floodplains, and marshy lowlands. Any tank attack here inevitably stretched into narrow corridors between water and swamp, where maneuvering was almost impossible, and the defense knew in advance which roads you would take. Adding an early thaw to this made the picture almost mocking. An army created for deep penetration into operational space was being driven into terrain where even light vehicles were cramped, and heavy ones simply had nowhere to go off the few hard roads. But the quartermaster reports that landed on the command's desk painted a completely different picture, and this picture they tried to keep from unnecessary eyes. Divisions bearing illustrious names had long ceased to match their authorized strength. Many tank battalions had only a portion of their assigned vehicles operational. The rest stood under repair or awaited spare parts that did not exist. Veteran crews, decimated in the Ardennes and near Budapest, were diluted with hastily trained replacements, boys taught to drive a heavy tank for a few weeks. And most importantly, fuel. Fuel reserves for this entire steel mass were measured not in weeks of free maneuver, but literally in a few refuelings. The army being prepared for a deep breakthrough of tens of kilometers physically lacked the fuel for that breakthrough. Shells could be brought up, men could be assembled, but there was nothing to pour into the tanks. External might concealed empty fuel tanks. This gap between parade ground power and actual condition is the key to the entire operation. At meetings, they cited the number of divisions, listed the famous names of formations, showed thick arrows on the map. But behind each arrow stood a specific battalion with half its vehicles under repair, crews diluted with novices, and fuel in the tanks for one or two moves. For Germany, the war had long since turned into an arithmetic of scarcity, and this arithmetic was inexorable. One could issue an order to attack. One could not, by order, create fuel that did not exist or prepared crews who had already been killed. The offensive was prepared by people who knew the real numbers perfectly well, and precisely because of that, many of them did not believe in success from the outset. The chief of the German General Staff, Heinz Guderian, directly opposed this operation. In his post-war memoirs, he frankly wrote that he considered the redeployment of the 6th SS Panzer Army to the south a grave mistake. Guderian wanted to use the last mobile reserve for defense on the Oder to shield Berlin from the inevitable Soviet blow. He understood what the Führer refused to acknowledge. Even if the Hungarian oil could be held for a few more months, it would not save a country whose enemies' tanks stood at the capital's doorstep. The dispute between them was not a tactical one. It was a dispute over what was more important, the front on the Oder or the oil at Balaton. The Führer chose the oil, and the dispute was lost even before the first tank moved forward. In this dispute, two ways of looking at the war collided. One, cold, staff-based, accustomed to calculating distances, supplies, and deadlines. It said that the Reich's time was measured, and the last reserve must be spent only where the main issue was decided. The other, desperate, clinging to the idea of a miracle resource supposedly capable of turning the tide. The fuel logic sounded convincing. Without oil, the army would stop. But it overlooked a simple thing. Even full tanks would not help if the country were finished off from another direction before that oil could reach the front. Berlin preferred to believe in the oil because it was more convenient to believe in it. To acknowledge Guderian's correctness would have meant acknowledging that the war could no longer be saved by any reserves. Thus, the classic paradox of strength took shape. The offensive was prepared not because they were ready to attack, but because waiting seemed even more terrible. With each passing day, oil fields could be lost, synthetic plants burned under bombs, and without fuel, the army would turn into an open-air museum. The blow at Balaton was not a gesture of confidence or a calculation by the strong. It was a flight forward, an attempt by a desperate gambler to put his last chips on the table, hoping to recoup losses when the cash box was already empty. In 41, such blows were struck from an abundance of strength. In 45, this blow was struck from fear of their own end. On the other side of the front, this gamble was calculated in advance. Marshal Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front did not intend to meet the blow head-on in an open field. Relying on intelligence data and captured documents, the Soviet command had already assumed in February that the Germans would attempt a counterblow precisely here, between the lakes, for the sake of the oil. The Stavka directly warned Tolbukhin of the likely German offensive, and instead of throwing his tank armies forward and clashing with the fresh SS divisions in a head-on meeting engagement, Tolbukhin did the opposite. He dug the defense into the ground. This decision required restraint because it went against instinct. When intelligence reports the concentration of enemy tanks, the easiest thing is to strike first, disrupt the enemy's plans, prevent him from preparing. Tolbukhin did not succumb to this. He understood that a head-on meeting engagement with a mass of heavy tanks would benefit precisely the Germans, that in such a clash, momentary armor density decides the outcome. However, a deep, pre-constructed defense shifts the battle to a different plane, one where artillery, mines, mud, and time are the decisive factors. He deliberately ceded the initiative of the first move to the enemy, in order to seize for himself the outcome of the entire game. This was not passivity, but cold calculation. Let the Germans walk into the sack prepared for them. On the axis of the expected strike, a deeply echeloned anti-tank system was created. On certain sectors, its depth reached up to 30 kilometers. This was not a single line of trenches, but several successive defensive belts, each with its own anti-tank strongpoints. Hundreds of guns were consolidated into anti-tank strongpoints, positioned to engage breakthrough tanks with flanking crossfire. Fields were sown with mines, guns were dug in on tank-threatened axes, alternate positions were prepared, and roads were blocked. Artillery was deployed with the intent of delivering massed fire on narrow breakthrough corridors. And Tolbukhin deliberately left the 9th Guards Army untouched, holding it in reserve, not for defense, but for the future offensive on Vienna. He was not patching holes in advance. He was not preparing a shield. He was preparing a mousetrap, for which the spring of a counterblow was already stored. The essence of such a defense was not to stop a tank at the first line, but to let it inside and exhaust it there. Each breached belt did not open up space for the Germans, but merely led them to the next, even denser one. Anti-tank areas were arranged so that a breakthrough vehicle would come under fire from several sides at once. Minefields channeled movement into pre-sighted corridors. Artillery observers sat on the heights and knew the ranges to every landmark in advance. The deeper the German wedge was drawn into this system, the more it lost speed, the denser the fire became, and the harder it was to bring up fuel and ammunition along the only surviving roads. The defense functioned not as a wall, but as a quagmire. The harder you press into it, the deeper you sink. The offensive began before dawn on the 6th of March, and almost immediately the plan collided with two adversaries not marked on any staff map: the weather and its own weight. An early thaw turned the Hungarian plain into a quagmire. The ground, which German staffs had expected to be frozen and passable, had thawed and turned to mud. The lowlands between lakes, canals, river floodplains, all had turned to mush. What looked on the map like a flat field for a tank wedge was in reality a viscous swamp, crisscrossed by canals and overflowing rivers. Heavy equipment left the few hard-surfaced roads and immediately bogged down. And it was through this mire that the heaviest machines in the world launched their attack. The first hours of the offensive still gave an illusion of success. In some sectors, the Germans managed to wedge into the Soviet defense, occupy the first trenches, and advance forward. Upbeat reports went up the chain. But by the end of the first day, it became clear that the pace planned for the operation was unattainable. Where, according to calculations, tanks were supposed to break out into operational space by evening, they were still picking at the first defense line, getting stuck in the mud and exposing themselves to flanking fire. Every kilometer was gained at the cost of bogged-down vehicles and a disrupted timetable. And any lag behind schedule for an offensive whose fuel was rationed by the drop meant not just a delay, it meant that the fuel would run out before the objective was reached. It is worth pausing here on one figure to grasp the scale of the absurdity. The
King Tiger weighed almost 70 tons. 70 tons of armor and steel, designed for firm ground and hard-surfaced roads. In the Hungarian mud of March 1945, these machines sank up to their hulls, bellied out, and became immobile. 70 tons that could not be moved. And there was nothing to pull them out with. Recovery vehicles bogged down right behind them. And most importantly, there wasn't enough of that very fuel for which the whole thing had been undertaken for evacuation and towing.
According to the testimonies of officers from the headquarters of the 6th SS Panzer Army, which later formed the basis of the book by its former staff officer Georg Meyer, Drama Between Budapest and Vienna, serviceable heavy tanks simply had to be abandoned. Not knocked out in combat, not burned by enemy shells, drowned in a field. Mud and empty fuel tanks destroyed more German armor than enemy fire. This is the true price of a blitzkrieg without fuel. The most powerful equipment in the world turns into an immobile target under its own weight. Within this heaviness lay another paradox of German tank design. Machines like the King Tiger were created as the pinnacle of engineering thought. Thickest armor, a powerful gun capable of engaging the enemy at great distance. In a one-on-one duel, on firm ground, such a tank was indeed a formidable opponent. But the war at Lake Balaton was not a duel on a testing ground. Here, what mattered was not frontal thickness or firing range, but cross-country capability, reliability, and operational range. A heavy machine with enormous fuel consumption, a fragile suspension, and monstrous weight in muddy conditions turned from an advantage into a burden. The more advanced and heavier the tank, the more surely it sank in the first sodden lowland. The giant armor saved the crew from a shell, but was powerless against ordinary spring mud. To visualize this, imagine one road across a sodden field. A column of heavy machines crawls along it because off to the side, on the plowed land, they sink immediately. The lead tank gets stuck in a rut, and the entire column halts. There is nowhere to turn off, swamped to the left and right. Sappers under fire try to corduroy the road with logs and whatever comes to hand. Other vehicles press from behind, and somewhere further back on washed-out roads, the fuel trucks are hopelessly lagging. And this frozen iron snake becomes a perfect target for artillery, which has long since zeroed in on every such road. One accurate barrage, and several vehicles burn at once on the narrow strip, blocking the path for the rest. Thus melted the Reich's finest armored force, not in a glorious meeting engagement, but in traffic jams in the middle of a swamp. And the enemy's fire did not remain silent either. Having advanced into the depth of the defense, the German divisions ended up precisely where they were being led. Each breached belt revealed the next, even more saturated with artillery. Anti-tank batteries fired from the flanks, from prepared positions, at the already slowed-down bogging machines. A tank stuck in mud under crossfire is no longer a tank, but a coffin with a crew waiting for its shell. The combat journal of the 3rd Ukrainian Front recorded the methodical work of artillery against armored vehicles stuck on sodden roads and in floodplains. Where the German wedge planned to pass in a day, it gnawed through the defense for a week, leaving burned out and abandoned tanks on every kilometer. South of the lake, the SS divisions managed, at the cost of enormous effort, to wedge in over 30 kilometers. Command reports upward spoke of success, of captured lines, of advances. But this was not a breakthrough. This was being drawn into the sack that Tolbukhin had prepared in advance. The deeper the Germans advanced, the denser the fire on their flanks became, and the further their supply lines lagged behind. In the middle of the offensive, the German command did what textbooks call committing the second echelon. It threw fresh tank formations into the fray to crush the defense where the first blow had already lost its momentum. On the map, this looked logical: to increase pressure at the spearhead, to break through the final line. On the ground, it meant only one thing. New hundreds of vehicles were being drawn into the same narrow, enfiladed, sodden throat, with just as little room to turn aside. The reserve, which could have been a trump card in a war of maneuver, was being fed into the same meat grinder as the first echelon. Instead of splitting the front, the result was a denser concentration of their own columns under fire. Each new division did not widen the breach but merely added more targets for Soviet artillery. And here it is worth returning once more to the difference in the optics of the two sides. German reports measured success in captured villages and kilometers traversed, and by this measure the offensive for a time appeared to be progressing. The Soviet command, however, measured events differently. How many German tanks were burned and abandoned, how stretched their rear areas were, how soon they would run out of fuel. By the first measure, the Germans seemed to be advancing. By the second, they were losing with every kilometer covered because every step forward brought closer the moment when their vehicles would stall without fuel deep inside the enemy's defense. The two sides looked at the same map and saw opposite things on it. Another decision of the Soviet command also worked, the calculation regarding the Germans' auxiliary attacks. The offensive of the 2nd Tank Army at Najikhanija and the strike by Army Group E across the flooded Drava River, which were supposed to draw off Soviet reserves, themselves became bogged down in the same mud and the same prepared defenses. The rivers had overflowed their banks, the crossings were under fire, and the swampy floodplains consumed equipment no less effectively than at Lake Balaton. The auxiliary attacks failed to draw off sufficient forces and did not create the promised threat. Instead of a single coordinated strike along converging lines, there were several separate, individually floundering offensives, each solving its own local task and achieving decisive success nowhere. The elegant scheme of encirclement remained just a scheme. By the 15th of March, the offensive had completely run out of steam. The tank divisions, for which the defense of the rest of Germany had been stripped bare, were stuck in the mud, having exhausted their fuel, their men, and the very inertia of the assault. They had advanced, but they had not broken through, and in an offensive, that means defeat. And the next day, the 16th of March, the other side spoke up. Tolbukhin's troops, with the support of the neighboring front, launched their own offensive toward Vienna, the very one for which the 9th Guards Army had been carefully preserved in advance. The fresh reserve struck the flank of the German grouping, exhausted and bled white by the 10-day slaughter in the swamps. The tanks that could still move now had to be saved, not thrown forward. They had to be turned westward, withdrawn from under attack. What was planned as a German strike to save the South turned into a springboard for the Soviet offensive. It was precisely in this role reversal that Tolbukhin's main trap lay. The Germans spent 10 days, all their fuel, and the bulk of their striking power to batter their way deep into the defense. And at the very moment when they were completely spent, bogged down and overextended, a fresh, deliberately preserved reserve struck their flank. This is the classic signature of wearing down the enemy on prepared lines and then launching a counteroffensive against a bled-out foe. The German command itself exposed its last tank army to this blow by drawing it into a place from which there was no quick exit. They no longer had the strength to attack, and to retreat in an organized manner. They had neither the fuel nor the time. The withdrawal proved even more difficult than the advance. Vehicles that had crawled forward with great difficulty through the mud now had to be dragged back under increasing pressure, and every piece of equipment stuck at a crossing meant a traffic jam, shelled from the air and by artillery. It was during the withdrawal that the majority of the heavy tanks were abandoned and blown up, not because they were knocked out, but because there was nothing to pull them out with and nothing to refuel them with. There exists a bitter phrase attributed to Dietrich himself. His 6th Tank Army, it is said, should have been called that because it had only 6 tanks left. The veracity of these words is debatable, but they convey the mood precisely. From the formidable armored fist assembled from across the entire front, pitiful remnants remained very quickly. This was the delayed catastrophe. Tactically, the offensive looked like an attempt to save the oil and the South. Strategically, it destroyed the last thing that could still cover Germany itself. The best tank divisions of the Reich were knocked out, bled white, and rolled back westward, abandoning equipment along the roads. According to various estimates, in these battles the Germans lost about 40,000 men and the majority of the armored vehicles they had assembled, not so much from enemy fire as from mud, breakdowns, and a lack of fuel during the withdrawal.
The road to Vienna was now open. The Austrian capital fell in April. And near Berlin, where Guderian wanted to see this reserve, there was nothing left to cover the capital. The oil, for which it had all been started, was not held for long either. The Reich spent its last trump card and received nothing in return except new graveyards of equipment in the Hungarian mud. If one looks at this from the height of the entire war, the picture becomes even clearer.
The reserve, capable of delaying the Soviet strike on the Berlin direction for at least a few weeks, was expended hundreds of kilometers from Berlin on terrain that itself destroyed equipment. In return, Germany gained neither retained oil, nor time won, nor a saved front. It received an open road to Vienna and a denuded Berlin direction simultaneously. One erroneous strategic choice resulted in a double loss, both where they attacked and where they were obliged to defend. Thus, the last major blow of the Wehrmacht became not a turn of fate, but an accelerator of its own end. The finale of this story received a ghastly human touch. Upon learning of the failure, the Führer flew into a rage, not at himself, not at his own plan, divorced from the reality of supply, but at the SS troops who had executed this plan. He issued an order that went down in history as the Order on Cuff Titles. The elite divisions, the very Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, and Hohenstaufen, were to remove the honorary name patches from their sleeves as a mark of disgrace. Those very soldiers who for years had been called the Guard and thrown into the toughest spots on the front were now publicly humiliated for failing to do the impossible, to advance without fuel through impassable mud against prepared defenses. Sepp Dietrich, according to accounts, was furious at this order and, it is believed, refused to convey it to his units in full. A malicious legend has also survived, that in response to the order, the SS men collected their awards and insignia into a soldier's chamber pot and sent it upstairs. This is not documented, and such a story should be treated as a frontline tale, but even as a legend, it accurately conveys the chasm that trust between the Führer and his Guard had become. This order was symptomatic in its own way. It showed that those at the top still refused to acknowledge the real reason for the defeat. They blamed the soldiers and their insignia, not the plan that sent heavy tanks to sink in the spring floodplain without fuel. It was easier to accuse the Guard of lacking willpower than to admit to oneself that the operation had been doomed from the conceptual stage. This gesture encapsulates the entire tragicomedy of the late Reich. A battle lost due to mud and empty fuel tanks was explained by a lack of valor, and punished by the removal of honorific ribbons. The medal sank into the swamp, but the people were punished. Analyzing the Balaton defensive operation using declassified documents and loss reports, Russian historian Alexei Isayev emphasizes a simple fact. The outcome was predetermined not by the ferocity of the attackers nor the valor of individual crews, but by fuel, weather, and a skillfully constructed defense in depth. The map and the ground diverged, and those sitting in the sinking tanks paid for this gap. One can talk endlessly about the quality of German armor and crew training, but none of it mattered where a vehicle was stuck up to its turret and the nearest fuel truck was 15 kilometers away down a washed-out road. Here, one must honestly mention the historians' debate, as there are many surrounding this operation. Some see in it primarily strategic folly, dictated by an obsession with oil. Others point out that without fuel, the German army truly was doomed, and then the strike at Balaton appears not as madness but as a desperate yet in its own way logical attempt. A third group argues over casualty figures, the exact number of abandoned tanks, and to what extent the mud season was decisive versus the Soviet defense. But almost all agree on one point. The outcome was not determined by bravery on the battlefield. It was determined by far more prosaic things: liters of fuel, road conditions, and who better calculated the enemy's moves several steps ahead. In this sense, Balaton is an almost clinically pure example that wars are won not by the most powerful tank, but by the most sober calculation. It is useful to compare this strike with how the German army advanced at the beginning of the war. In 41, Blitzkrieg worked because behind the arrows on the map stood real power: fuel, functional equipment, air superiority,
well-oiled supply, and the initiative. Back then, fast armored wedges truly sliced through the front and closed encirclements. At Balaton, all that remained of Blitzkrieg were the arrows on the map and the grand names of divisions. Everything else, fuel, machine reliability, air superiority, crew freshness, was on the enemy's side. The external form of the attack mirrored 41, but there was no substance behind it anymore. It was an empty shell of Blitzkrieg draped over an army that had nothing left to breathe with. Amid all the strategic calculations, it is easy to forget that this operation also had a very specific human cost. Inside the sinking and burning tanks sat living people, both experienced veterans and hastily trained boys, shoved into heavy machines mere weeks before the end. They advanced into an offensive, whose outcome many at the top already understood, through mud where their equipment was doomed from the start. Tens of thousands of them did not return, not because they met an equal opponent in fair combat, but because they were sent to solve an impossible task with empty tanks. The price of someone else's stubbornness and orders detached from reality is always paid in the same coin, the lives of those on the sharp end. Sometimes the strongest blow is simply an elegant way to waste what should have been preserved. The Reich sought oil to continue the war, and for its sake, burned the army that could have prolonged that war even a little longer. The last tanks sank into a Hungarian field, never reaching their objective, under orders that those at the top could no longer support.
And the main question remains open. What was it really? A desperate attempt at salvation, or merely an expensive way to delay an end that those at the top already knew was coming?